everybody, are you currently sat there bemoaning the fact that you didn't buy a Lotus Elise when you had the chance? A few years ago, when they were simply an old Lotus that hadn't been updated in ages, and you could pick up an example of a great many of them fairly cheaply, before they announced the car was going to be axed and then prices suddenly went skywards. Fear not, because you may actually have a second opportunity. Thanks to our good friend Badge Engineering, about 23 years ago the world was introduced to a version of the Lotus Elise, very closely related, built on the same chassis, in the same factory, providing even greater performance, and which today costs even less money. That was the Opel Speedster, or as we called it in Britain, the Vauxhall VX220. And today, I'm driving the spiciest of them all, the VXR220. So, with pedigree like this, it should be a great car, and even more than that, a bit of a bargain too. Is it? Let's find out. If today's video gets you on the hunt for a VXR of your own, be it 220, Corsa, Astra, or one of those wonderful Holden-derived things, then don't forget to use CarVertical, the super-powered super search that's just had a rebrand, making their reports even easier to read. All you need is a VIN or a registration number and just 60 seconds. CarVertical works on both desktop and mobile and will cross-reference a number of databases to give you all the information you want to know on any potential used car purchase, from accident damage to usage as a taxi. For a special discount of 10%, don't forget to use my code JAYEMM. The origins of the VX220 are fairly well known, but a quick recap. The story starts with the original Lotus Elise, the Series 1, that debuted in the mid-1990s. That was a game-changing car for Lotus, a project that rose from the ashes of the ill-fated M100 and almost certainly turned around the fortunes of the company. It was also a car, and I think it's very rare you can say this about a Lotus, that was so dominant in its segment it killed a couple of its rivals pretty much straight away, the Caterham 21 and the Renault Sport Spider, both of which are very cool cars that I'd love to get my hands on. The Spider in particular, that's just a weird car. In any case, the Elise was a hit, but come the turn of the millennium and it had a problem. Its inspired ultra-lightweight construction wasn't likely to pass crash regulations for much longer, but Lotus didn't have the money to keep the project going. So, former owner GM stepped in and said, hey, we'll stump up the cash for you to develop a Mark II car, but we'd like one to sell for ourselves, please. So this car was developed alongside the second generation Elise. It shares the same platform, was built in the same factory by the same Roberts. However, it does differ in a few key ways. First off, the styling. It is totally different. Yes, the rough dimensions and proportions are basically the same as a Series 2 Elise, but you'd never really mistake the one for the other. I actually have to say that I quite like the look of the VX. It's a very striking thing, and I think if you scaled it up about sort of 50%, you might call it a noble of some sort. It's a really nice thing. The interior was also trimmed just about differently enough that they did feel modestly independent of one another, but it's here that really they do feel most closely related. But for many, the biggest difference between the two is in terms of powertrain. To begin with, for the Series 2 Elise, Lotus stuck with the venerable Rover K-Series, later switching to Toyota. However, for the General Motors offering, the VX220 and the Opel Speedster, you had a choice initially of a 2.2-litre naturally aspirated GM Ecotec engine, making just under 150 horsepower, and then later a 2-litre but turbocharged engine, making just about 200. This was significant because even the 145 horsepower version of the car was a little bit pokier than the vast majority of Elises that had sold up until that point, and the turbo variant eclipsed the power of just about all bar the most special and rarest of the Elises. The ultimate evolution of the VX then landed in about 2004, with this, the UK-only VXR220, notably the first Vauxhall ever to wear the VXR badging. It was built in very limited numbers, though sources disagree as to whether they made 65 or just 60 of them. In any case, there weren't many. Changes included an uprated engine which now made the 220 horses to match the model's name. You also got a lower, stiffer suspension, these beautiful Speedline wheels which are 16-inch in diameter at the front and 17 at the back. The tyres then are also wider, 195 up the front and 225 at the back. You also got these nicely trimmed seats, though I should point out the 4-point harnesses that this car wears alongside the regular 3-pointer were added later. The 5-speed manual gearbox is the same as you'd find in every other VX, and with all of those, it's not exactly a luxurious or feature-packed car. You've got air conditioning, you've even got a start button, helpfully unlabelled here in the middle, but you don't have electric windows, electric roof, or just about anything else. Of course, the point of all these cars has always been that you don't need any of that. And honestly, it's been a long time since I've got in an Elise-based car, but it doesn't take long for you to remember just why they're so fantastic. This is a very, very special thing. Beautifully light steering, even at lower speeds. It's not difficult, wonderfully communicative. You can sense everything. The chassis gives you so much confidence. Michael, this car's owner, who also has the 355 F1 that I recently drove and also owns a 575 F1. So if you'd like to see Ferrari 550 versus 575, we want to make that happen, and I'll make it happen quicker if you hop into the comment section and say, yes, we want to see that video. Anyway, he's also got this, and I can see why he does, because you know what? I got a lot more confidence to chuck this around than I would a 355. It just talks to you in a way the Ferrari simply doesn't. But he's not a track fiend, so this car is sitting on Uniroyal Rain Sports because he doesn't feel like it needs any more. And you know what? I'm kind of inclined to agree with him. You can feel it doesn't have unlimited grip, but that's fine. It communicates what it does have so well. It's not an issue. It's just not. Visibility is also, perhaps unsurprisingly, excellent. Get the roof off, which honestly should be a legal requirement unless it's absolutely hacking it down, and not only do you not feel anywhere near as claustrophobic as you should, but you have this amazing sense of connection with the road and your surroundings. If I were being critical, your sort of rear 3/4 over here is a little bit compromised, but you know, move ever so slightly, do a lifesaver, and you'll be fine. The styling of the car also gives you something nice and interesting to look at. You've got a very shapely front end, which is really quite pretty. Now, allegedly, the VXR220 is also marginally lighter than a regular Turbo 2, though I couldn't find out exactly how they'd achieved that or what the weight saving was. In any case, I don't think it's particularly relevant because they're all super lightweight. I don't think a single one of them ever came in at over a ton. I do seem to recall them always being slightly heavier than the Elise, but that's largely due in part to the engine they used. When Lotus went over to the Toyota setup, their car also gained a fair few kilos. The K-Series is a very light engine. This car is entirely unmodified, and honestly, it's proof that if you've got something light enough, 220 horsepower is more than enough to have a lot of fun. Perhaps conveniently, the last car that I actually road tested was the Alfa Romeo 4C, a much more modern take on a very similar formula. So that also has a, well, just under 2-litre turbocharged 4-cylinder. In place of the manual gearbox, it has a dual clutch. It's also got a little bit more technology inside, and the all-important, some will tell you, carbon fibre chassis. It's a bigger car too, and I will admit, far, far prettier. The 4C is just stunning. It too has unassisted steering, but famously, it was just never as good as an Elise's, or, I can now tell you, a VXR220's. The 4C that I drove, I'm pretty sure, had undergone some geometry setting changes because it did not exhibit the waywardness for which the model had become famous and that I had personally experienced quite a few times. Honestly, you'd drive along a road like this in a 4C and every now and again it felt like someone just grabbed the wheel out of your hand. Quite terrifying. This maybe doesn't have quite the same off-center turn-in, the same keenness that car does, but it feels considerably softer, considerably plusher, which has surprised me, this being the R and all. I think the rubber is contributing to that somewhat, but the fact is, it's really well set up for these roads. Even the really rough sections like this just don't faze it. Honestly, the thing that's going to fatigue you in here, much like an Elise, is the noise. There is essentially no insulation in here. There's a little bit of carpeting, but honestly, it's token stuff at best. And of course, if you've got the roof off, which I would always recommend, you're going to get a lot of wind noise. Simple as that. Incidentally, the roof appears to be what Lotus owners would term the short version, which is much easier to use. The early Series 2 Elise had another connection back there that made it just a little bit more fiddly than it really needed to be. This, I think, always had this system and is better for it. And honestly, this is one of the times I'd forgive a car for being a little bit too firm for road usage, but honestly, though it is a little bouncier than all the other Series 2 Elise and VX220s that I've driven, it's not uncomfortable at all. In fact, I've driven many cars with just aftermarket suspension that are firmer than this. It works. I also generally have something of a dislike of turbocharged engines in lightweight cars like this, because to me, the real point of having a turbo is the extra torque that you get. And if your car doesn't weigh anything, you just don't need it. What you do need is throttle response, interactivity, a nice high red line and all that. And while this engine doesn't give you the high red line, it's still surprisingly responsive, very well mannered, and sounds all right too. Again, stock exhaust, the whole car is completely standard. And that leads me onto the biggest problem with not just the VXR220, but all 220s and Speedsters in general, particularly the turbo ones, because they were not only a more affordable alternative to an Elise, but also the ones with forced induction had such tuning potential, many of them have been modified. I found an example of one of these that had got sold through collecting cars a while ago, and it had been tuned to over 300 horsepower, near 350 I think. I mean, I'm sure that's an exciting car, but it doesn't need it. It just doesn't. It's got the right amount of power for the chassis. For these kind of roads, you don't need any more. You just don't. It in fact took Michael over 2 years to track down a VXR, which is the one he always wanted, and in case you're wondering, they are all red, but that wasn't modified. He found a few, and they do command a significant premium over the regular car, but to get one without anything done to it was a task. I think he's wise for not just buying one, but also keeping it as it is, because to me, this is a great example of a car that is shockingly rare and really does deserve to be preserved. I don't think I should go as far as to say you shouldn't buy a car that's been modified, because it is really par for the course with these things. However, if you are looking at a car that's been modified, particularly for extra power, do look very closely at it, whether all of the upgrades have been done to a reasonable standard, and get a feel for if the owner's the sort of person that's clearly looked after the car, warmed it through before they've thrashed it, etc, etc. Make sure the service schedule has been kept to. The turbos have a belt it needs doing every 4 years. Has that been done? And do make sure, if any parts are required, they aren't ones that are really annoyingly difficult to get a hold of. Most stuff I'm told you can get for these, but you will come across the occasional part that is difficult to track down. So then, what are you going to be paying for these? Well, it's good news, bad news. The bad news is that along with the Elise prices going up, so have VX220 prices. The good news is that they remain a more affordable alternative. So, whereas your entry point into a half-decent looking Elise that doesn't seem to be an absolute rotter is sort of 16 grand, for a VX220, it's about 10. To get you into a turbo then is probably mid-teens and upwards, but if you do want a VXR, if you can find one, which today I couldn't, I expect you're going to want to pay anywhere between sort of 24 and 30,000 pounds, which means at that price you could get yourself plenty of Elise, including some of the spicier later supercharged variants. But this is really just as good a car, because it is an Elise ultimately, and this is probably just about the only time where people would be utterly and totally delighted that their car shares a lot with a Lotus. I know, it sounds like the worst recipe ever, doesn't it? A Vauxhall version of a Lotus. And yet somehow it works, not just a bit, but magnificently. I like this car a lot. It does also feel quite nice in here. I mean, I know it's got sort of weird fake carbon fibrous stuff going on, but the pedals are nice. Yes, the cabin is intimate. The boots and alright size, by the way, certainly better than in the 4C, I can tell you. And again, if you want to get yourself into a 4C, well, you're going to be spending at least 40,000 quid, really, up to 50. One of these at less than half the price, it's a lot more than half the car, I can tell you. And in fact, if what's really important to you isn't numbers, but feel and interaction, I think this beats the 4C. And I think it's definitely worth reminding ourselves that without this car, we never would have got a second or third generation Elise. So for that, I think a big thank you towards General Motors is well deserved. And of course, as ever, a big thanks to Michael, the owner, for bringing this car out, and to you for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button, comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already. I'll see you for the next one. Bye-bye.